The sky turned a sickly shade of green as the mushroom cloud rose high into the air, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. The ground shook violently as a wave of heat washed over the group of survivors, forcing them to take cover. They knew that this was the end of the world as they knew it. The group had been traveling across Texas when the bombs fell. They had been on the road for days, fleeing the destruction and chaos that had engulfed the city. They had heard rumors of a safe haven, a place where they could take shelter from the fallout and wait for rescue. So, they had set out on foot, determined to find this sanctuary and survive. But now, as they huddled together in fear, they realized that the safe haven they had been seeking was nothing more than a myth. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The only thing they could do was try to survive. The group consisted of 6 people: Sarah, a nurse; Tom, a mechanic; Anna, a college student; John, a retired military man; Emily, a housewife; and Sam, a high school student. They were all strangers to each other before the disaster, but now they were bound together by their shared fear and desperation. They had been walking for hours when the first bomb fell. It had been a distant explosion, but they had seen the bright flash in the sky and heard the thunderous boom. They had picked up the pace, hoping to outrun the destruction. But the second bomb had hit much closer. The shockwave had knocked them off their feet, and the blast had deafened them. They had stumbled through the rubble, coughing and choking on the dust and debris. It was then that they had stumbled upon the farmhouse. It was a ramshackle structure, barely standing, but it offered some shelter from the fallout. They had rushed inside and barricaded the doors and windows. Now, as they sat in the cellar, listening to the ominous silence outside, they knew that they were not alone. They could hear strange noises coming from the upper floors, and they could feel a palpable sense of dread in the air. The group huddled together, trying to keep their spirits up. They talked about their families, their dreams, and their hopes for the future. But the conversation was strained and forced, as they all knew that their chances of survival were slim. As the hours passed, the group became increasingly anxious. They had no food, no water, and no way of knowing how long they would have to stay in the cellar. The radiation was already starting to take its toll, and they could feel the effects of the fallout on their bodies. They tried to remain calm, but the fear was overwhelming. They were trapped in a nightmare, with no escape. The end of the world had come, and they were the last ones standing. And as they huddled together, waiting for the next bomb to fall, they knew that they would do whatever it took to survive. Even if it meant facing horrors beyond their wildest nightmares. The survivors in the farmhouse cellar had been huddled together for what felt like an eternity. The constant sound of silence and the dull glow of the dimly lit space made it feel like they were trapped in a nightmare. Sarah, the nurse, was the first to suggest that they explore the farmhouse above them. She thought that they might be able to find some food or supplies that could help them survive. Tom, the mechanic, was hesitant to leave the safety of the cellar, but he knew that they needed to take the risk. The group slowly made their way up the creaky wooden stairs, their eyes scanning the dusty old furniture and broken glass that littered the floor. They moved cautiously, afraid of what they might find. As they reached the top of the stairs, they found themselves in a large, dimly lit room. The furniture was old and rotting, and the air was thick with dust. They searched the room, but there was nothing of value to be found. They moved through the house, room by room, searching for any sign of life or supplies. But the house was empty, and the survivors began to feel like they were the last people on Earth. They eventually made their way to the kitchen, where they found a few cans of food and some bottled water. They were relieved to have found something, but it wasn't enough to sustain them for long. As they made their way back to the cellar, they heard a strange noise coming from the darkness. It sounded like a low growl, and it sent shivers down their spines. They cautiously approached the source of the noise, and they found a door leading to the basement. Tom tried to open the door, but it was stuck. He put his shoulder into it and pushed with all his might, and it finally gave way with a loud creak. The door swung open, revealing a dark and foreboding staircase leading down into the depths. The survivors hesitated for a moment, but their curiosity got the better of them. They descended the stairs, one by one, their eyes adjusting to the darkness. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large, damp room. The walls were lined with shelves, and the room was filled with strange objects and tools. It looked like some sort of laboratory. Anna, the college student, approached one of the shelves and picked up a small vial of liquid. She examined it closely, trying to decipher the label. But before she could say anything, they heard a noise coming from the shadows. They turned towards the sound, and their blood ran cold. There, in the darkness, was a pair of glowing eyes. The eyes were followed by the outline of a dark, humanoid figure, slowly approaching them. The survivors froze in terror, not knowing what to do. The figure drew closer, and they could see that it was covered in a thick, black fur. It let out a deep growl, and the survivors knew that they were in grave danger. They turned and ran up the stairs, their hearts pounding in their chests. They slammed the door shut behind them, but they could hear the creature scratching at the wood. They knew that they were not alone in the farmhouse, and that the horrors they faced were beyond their wildest nightmares. The survivors huddled together in the cellar, their hearts racing from the encounter with the mysterious creature in the basement. They could still hear it scratching at the door, trying to find a way in. They knew they had to find a way to defend themselves. After catching their breath, the group began to explore the shelves and tables in the laboratory. They discovered vials of various chemicals, notes written in a language they couldn't understand, and strange devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. As they searched through the materials, Anna came across a journal that seemed to belong to the lab's owner. She carefully read through the pages, her eyes growing wider with each passing sentence. The journal belonged to a scientist named Dr. Henry Wilson, who had been conducting research on a new type of radiation that he believed could be used to create a new form of energy. He had built the lab in secret, using funds from a shadowy government agency. The more Anna read, the more she realized that Dr. Wilson's experiments had been the cause of the nuclear devastation that had covered Texas with radioactive fallout. His experiments had gone horribly wrong, causing a massive explosion that had destroyed everything in its path. The survivors were shocked and horrified by this revelation. They realized that they had been living in a nightmare created by the very man who had built the lab. They knew they had to find a way to stop Dr. Wilson's research before it could cause any more damage. They searched the lab for any clues that could help them find Dr. Wilson, but they found nothing. It seemed that he had disappeared without a trace. As they continued to search, they heard a strange noise coming from the cellar door. They cautiously approached the door, and to their surprise, they found a small boy, no more than 6 years old, standing on the other side. The boy was dirty and scared, but he seemed unharmed by the radiation. He told the survivors that his name was Timmy, and that he had been living in the basement of the farmhouse since the explosion. Timmy had been Dr. Wilson's assistant, helping him with his experiments in the lab. He had survived the explosion by hiding in the basement, but he had been too scared to leave until now. The survivors were shocked to hear this, but they knew that Timmy might be the key to finding Dr. Wilson. They asked him if he knew where the doctor had gone, but Timmy only shook his head. He had no idea where Dr. Wilson was or what he was planning to do next. As they pondered their next move, they heard a loud explosion coming from outside. They rushed to the cellar window, and to their horror, they saw a group of soldiers approaching the farmhouse. They knew that they had to hide before the soldiers found them. The survivors quickly realized that they were in danger. The soldiers approaching the farmhouse were heavily armed and appeared to be looking for survivors. They knew that they had to act fast if they wanted to avoid being captured or worse. The group hastily came up with a plan. They decided to split up into two teams. One team would stay behind and defend the cellar while the other would try to sneak out of the farmhouse and find a way to disable the soldiers' vehicles. Anna, Mark, and Timmy volunteered to be the team that would try to disable the soldiers' vehicles. They knew that it was a risky plan, but it was their only chance to escape. The other team, consisting of Sarah, Mike, and David, prepared to defend the cellar. They searched through the laboratory and found a few weapons that they could use to defend themselves. They knew that it would be a tough fight, but they were determined to survive. As the soldiers approached the farmhouse, the team defending the cellar could hear their footsteps getting closer. Sarah, Mike, and David took their positions, ready to fight. They could see the soldiers' shadows moving outside the window. Suddenly, the cellar door burst open, and the soldiers stormed in. Sarah, Mike, and David fought bravely, using all the weapons they had found in the lab. They managed to take down a few soldiers, but they were outnumbered, and the soldiers' weapons were much more powerful. Meanwhile, Anna, Mark, and Timmy made their way to the soldiers' vehicles. They knew that disabling them would be their only chance of escape. They managed to sneak past the soldiers, who were too preoccupied with the fight in the cellar to notice them. Anna quickly got to work, using her knowledge of mechanics to disable the soldiers' vehicles. Mark and Timmy stood guard, watching out for any soldiers who might be coming their way. It was a nerve-wracking experience, but they managed to disable all the vehicles without getting caught. With the vehicles disabled, the soldiers were stranded at the farmhouse. The survivors in the cellar heard the soldiers shouting and cursing outside. They knew that they had won the first round, but they also knew that the soldiers wouldn't give up easily. The survivors regrouped, and they knew that they had to come up with a new plan. They realized that they had to find a way to escape from the farmhouse before the soldiers found another way in. They decided to head to the barn, where they had seen a few horses earlier in the day. The survivors carefully made their way to the barn, keeping an eye out for any soldiers who might be lurking nearby. They found the horses, and with a little bit of coaxing, they managed to get them to follow them back to the farmhouse. The survivors quickly mounted the horses and rode off into the distance. They knew that they were taking a huge risk by leaving the safety of the farmhouse, but they also knew that they had no other choice. As they rode away, they could hear the soldiers shouting in the distance. They knew that the fight for survival was far from over. They had no idea what dangers lay ahead, but they were determined to keep fighting. The survivors rode their horses for miles, desperate to find a safe place to shelter. The world around them was desolate and barren, with only a few trees and shrubs dotting the landscape. They knew that they had to keep moving if they wanted to survive. As they rode, they came across a small town. The buildings were mostly destroyed, but there were a few intact structures that they could use as shelter. They cautiously approached the town, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. They found an abandoned house that looked relatively untouched by the nuclear devastation. The windows were boarded up, but the door was unlocked. The survivors cautiously entered the house, keeping their weapons at the ready. The interior of the house was dusty and musty, but it was still intact. They found a few rooms that were still habitable, and they quickly set up camp. They were exhausted from their long journey, but they knew that they couldn't let their guard down. As they settled in, they discussed their next move. They knew that they couldn't stay in one place for too long, as it would make them vulnerable to attack. They decided that they would have to search for other survivors and try to find a safe place to live. The next day, they set out on foot, leaving their horses behind. They searched for miles, calling out for other survivors, but there was no one to be found. The world around them was silent and empty. After a few hours of searching, they came across a small town. Unlike the previous town they had found, this one was still intact. The buildings were mostly made of stone, and they looked like they could withstand a nuclear attack. They cautiously entered the town, calling out for anyone who might be there. They found a few survivors, huddled together in a small building. They were emaciated and weak, but they were still alive. The survivors welcomed them in, sharing what little food and water they had. They told them that the town was relatively safe, as it was far away from any major cities or military bases. The survivors discussed their next move. They knew that they couldn't stay in the town forever, as it would eventually run out of resources. They decided to set out on foot once again, searching for a safe place to live. They walked for days, encountering nothing but desolate landscapes and destroyed buildings. Their food and water supplies were dwindling, and their morale was low. Just as they were about to give up hope, they came across a small village. The buildings were made of stone, and they looked like they had been built to withstand any disaster. They cautiously entered the village, calling out for anyone who might be there. To their surprise, they found a group of survivors, living in peace and harmony. The survivors welcomed them in, offering them food and shelter. The village had a farm and a well, which provided them with fresh food and water. The survivors were amazed by the resilience of the villagers, who had managed to survive in the midst of a nuclear apocalypse. They knew that they had finally found a safe place to live. They settled into the village, working alongside the villagers to rebuild and thrive in a world that had been destroyed by nuclear devastation. The survivors had finally found a safe place to live in the small village. They had been welcomed by the villagers, who had accepted them as part of their community. The survivors worked hard to rebuild the village, using their skills to help repair the buildings and tend to the crops. As time passed, the survivors became more and more integrated into the village. They had made friends and formed relationships with the other villagers, and they had come to think of the village as their home. However, living in the aftermath of a nuclear apocalypse was not without its challenges. The survivors had to deal with the constant threat of radiation, which made it difficult to grow crops and find clean water. They also had to deal with the threat of raiders and looters, who would sometimes attack the village in search of food and supplies. The survivors quickly learned that in this new world, survival came at a steep price. They had to be vigilant at all times, always on the lookout for danger. They had to be resourceful, using everything at their disposal to stay alive. One day, the survivors received a visitor. It was a man who claimed to be a trader, traveling from town to town in search of goods to trade. He offered to trade with the villagers, offering them food and supplies in exchange for their crops and livestock. At first, the villagers were wary of the trader. They had heard stories of traders who would cheat and swindle their customers, leaving them with nothing. However, the trader seemed honest and sincere, and he had brought with him a large stock of food and supplies. The survivors were excited at the prospect of trading with the trader. They had been running low on supplies, and they desperately needed food and medicine. They eagerly set about trading their goods with the trader, hoping to secure enough supplies to keep the village going for a while longer. However, as they began to trade, they began to realize that the trader was not what he seemed. He had brought with him contaminated food and medicine, laced with dangerous levels of radiation. The villagers soon began to fall sick, their bodies racked with pain and disease. The survivors realized too late that they had made a fatal mistake. They had trusted a stranger, and they had paid the price for their trust. The village was now in a desperate situation, with no access to clean food or water. They were left to face the consequences of their actions, living in a world where survival was a constant battle. The survivors were forced to confront the reality of their situation. They had come so far, surviving against all odds, only to be brought down by a single mistake. They knew that they had to keep fighting, to keep struggling against the odds, if they wanted to survive in this new world. As they tended to the sick and dying, the survivors came to understand the true cost of survival. It was a cost that they were willing to pay, no matter how high the price. For in this new world, survival was the only thing that mattered.